David Maynard was a highly educated man, going to med school when he was 17, getting married at 20, then jumping in the political realm over in Ohio. He started his own medical school and dipped his hand into the railroad, but pretty much lost everything in the Panic of 1837. His wife wouldn't let him forget how it was all his fault that they were broke, and so on. She cheated on him and made sure that he knew all about it. But for the sake of his children, he stayed with this wench until the kids were of age. At that point, he left for California with nothing but his doctor bag. Being a doctor really helped him finance his trek west, curing people of all kinds of disease, broken bones, and so on, making a few bucks here and there. Not all of his patients lived, though. There was a husband and wife with the wife's mother who was traveling to Oregon to join up with some family that had already made the trek. The guy got cholera and died. The mom also got cholera and died. And in her dying breath, begged for this doctor to make sure her daughter, Catherine, made it to Tumwater in the Oregon Territory. He promised that he would, and sure enough did. Along the way, they fell in love, to the point that he decided not to continue south to California in search for gold. He stayed right there and became a logger. Logging was a decent job, and for him was a part-time job since he was a doctor. Soon he realized he could make a ton more money if he got himself a ship and sold the lumber over in San Francisco instead of selling it to the shippers right there in the Puget Sound. So that's what he did, making over 10 times the amount that he would have. Maynard then used this mini fortune from logging to build himself a nice little store and bought in bulk. This way he could sell for way cheaper than all the other stores. He also used a credit system so people didn't have to pay up front like in all the other shops. This really ticked off all the shop owners in the area, and he was essentially told to leave or suffer the consequence. At this point, he met a tribal chief who was called Sealth, who was friendly to Maynard and made a deal with him to go to Elliott Bay up north and open shop there. And the tribe would supply him with a bunch of salmon that he could then salt and sell to the people in California, which is exactly what he did. Unfortunately, the majority of the salmon expired by the time it got to California. 900 kegs of rotten salmon. The store was built close to the water in the town of Duwamish. He had a good chunk of land, which he laid out the streets in a compass-styled way, but his neighbors didn't like that, so they made the streets on their property how they saw fit. Which is why driving in downtown Duwamish nowadays is just awful. The streets have weird connections, random ends. Duwamish is modern-day Seattle, by the way, and if you know the area, Pioneer Square is where Maynard's land was. Maynard wasn't all into the get-rich idea. He saw Duwamish as a potential great city like New York, so he did all kinds of extra jobs for little or no pay just to see it succeed. For example, the only lawyer in town died in a freak canoeing accident, so he studied up on law, passed the bar, and was the new lawyer in town. There were all kinds of issues with the Indians, so he spent a lot of time keeping the peace with a ton of help from his buddy Sealth, which you would know as Chief Sealth. He saw a need for a blacksmith, so he became one. And as soon as there was a blacksmith in town, he sold the blacksmith shop for pretty much nothing. He was a very hands-on philanthropist. He also believed that in order to build a great city, you needed to provide plenty of vices. So he set up the first saloon, brothel, and casino. At one point, he was made a delegate and voted to divide Oregon into 2 territories, making the new one they would call Washington. In doing this, they created new counties, one being King County, named after the Vice President William King, later to be renamed in 2005 after Martin Luther King Jr., because William King was a slave owner. Which is interesting because Chief Sealth literally ran a slave trade in the Puget Sound and had a few personal slaves, including some sex slaves. But anyway, Doc Maynard eventually decided he was tired of the city life and wanted to try his hand at farming. So he moved to New York Alki, which is just West Seattle, and tried to run a farm there, using kelp as fertilizer to grow potatoes. But in the end, he was not all that great. So he moved back to Duwamish, where he headed the effort to have the city renamed Seattle, and then built a hospital, which unfortunately didn't do so well because he treated both the Indians and the whites. so most people just went to other hospitals instead. And though Maynard had great rapport with the natives and was sympathetic with their, thoughts, he still believed that they needed to be conquered. During all this, he was able to get a virtual divorce from his first wife back east and married that gal that he met on the wagon train. They lived happily until wifey number 1 showed up in town demanding her half of his estate. In court, they fought, and Maynard was forced to give up half of his original estate, which he no longer had, and give to wife number 1. But the judge ruled that she was not entitled to it since she did not claim it within the time frame after the divorce. So Doc and wifey number 2 were all laughing and giddy until the judge said that he also didn't get to keep that half, and it also wouldn't go to wifey number 2, but instead would just go to the state. In the end, Doc died in his home, comfortable and beloved by many. His funeral was the greatest the city ever saw, and someone at his service said these words: "Without him, Seattle will not be the same. Without him, Seattle would not have been the same. Indeed, without him, Seattle might not be." If you liked that clip, you'll love the full podcast. Make sure you're subscribing to Ricky Mortensen on YouTube.